All right, let's see. Let's go ahead and get started. That was background music on the fly with a pandero because I couldn't get the background track to work. But welcome everyone to Indomitable Spirit, music of the African diaspora in the Americas, and we're really excited to spend the next hour or so with you talking about various musical roots and how they have blossomed today. I am super thrilled to have Benjamin Hunter here with me. Um, and Ben, welcome.
How's it going, Tony? Good to see you.
It's going really
It's good
well.
to
I
be
guess I
here.
should introduce myself as well. My name is Tony Gomez, and I am the host for the series Deep Roots, New Branches, which is a series developed with Early Music Seattle to explore the many different ways that we're challenged to look at music through new eyes and to hear it through new ears and to a certain extent question the assumptions that we've grown up with music and how what musical history looks like and sounds like. And so in this series we've explored the ways that for example that the golden age of Islam influenced the European Renaissance. We traveled to Latin America with mapping Latino musical migrations. And today we're going to do a deep dive on the experiences of the African diaspora in the Americas. And again, super thrilled to have a multi instrumentalist and to me, someone who is not only a musician but really a storyteller, and that's Benjamin Hunter, who's here with us from Seattle today. Thank you so much for being here today, Ben.
Thanks for having me. Really excited to continue where we left off.
Yeah, yeah. So we have had, and I should say too that we were also planning to have Dr. Monica Rojas with us today as well, and she's unable to join us because of a family situation. So we are keeping Monica and her family in our minds and hearts, and are looking forward to the next time that she can join in this conversation as well. But even just we know that Ben, you and I have done this before, and in our conversations with Monica, we know that there is way more than we can cover in 1 hour. As we're talking through some ideas and some history, but also sharing a little bit of music with each other. So we'll kind of dip our toe in the water a little bit and
Great,
and and see where the current takes us. Um,
great.
yeah, right. Well, and we were just before the call started, or before the presentation started, we were talking about we both grew up, in warmer places, and even though it's nice and warm here in the Northwest today, neither of us are thinking about getting anywhere near the water up here. It's just too cold.
Not even a thought.
Yeah, yeah. So, but we will dip our toe in the musical waters and see where that goes. Um, Ben, would you be open to starting us off with a song? And by way of introducing the song and the instrument you're going to be playing, tell us a little bit about your own story as a musician and as a keeper of popular music and folk music.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again for having me, Tony, to talk about such a vast and deep and important well of knowledge that I hope more people start to explore and seek out because it really does help. I think answer a lot of questions about the Americas in general, but just helps fill in a lot of the gaps or the intentional gaps about of where this music comes from and how the music that exists today that is so popular around the world today um, got to that popularity. Um, I I'm primarily a violinist. That was my first instrument, and was raised classically. And after I got somewhere in the middle of college, I went to this museum called the Musical Instrument Museum, which is in North Phoenix, Paradise Valley, and I had already had a fairly um, you know extensive background of world music. I was lucky and fortunate to be to have a mom that valued travel and new places and cultures. But going to that museum and seeing different bowed instruments from around the world really got me more excited than I think I ever have in my life about this instrument that I had been playing for so long already, and enjoyed and loved on one level. And so it kind of charted this path for me to want to explore folk and roots music from around the world. Um, and so, I'll open up with a song right now, a fiddle tune um, that was collected by these two guys named Blind Pete and George Ryan. It's called "Black Bayou Ain't Got No Bottom," and it's just, it's an example of these kind of obscure songs um, that are only obscure because the recording industry didn't seek out black fiddlers. Didn't think that there was much of a market for black fiddlers. And so, we kind of grow up now thinking that banjo and fiddle music is, this bluegrass tradition all comes from this kind of white culture. And it certainly does have roots in white America, but it also has deep roots in black America and the intermingling of both. And so here's that song to kick us off. So that was a cool fiddle tune by Blind Pete and George Ryan, and one of them would have been on guitar and one of them would have been on fiddle, obviously. But there's an extensive history of black fiddling in this country, um, and I think often as I was blind to the fact that there are bowed instruments from all around the world, certainly all across the continent of Africa, but also all over Asia too. And I think maybe we see a little bit more of those kind of instruments. Certainly in Seattle, there's people busking with violins from Vietnam and the Philippines and China, and Mongolia and Tibet. But there's a rich history of that in Africa, and that history and that knowledge of bowed instruments fed the style and the techniques of fiddling here in America that have led significantly and guided significantly the type of styles that we see in some of these popular forms of music like bluegrass and stuff that we have assigned to this white culture. So I'm excited to be here to talk a little bit about that. That's kind of like not all I do, but I do like to dig deep into these old forms of music and these old forms of folk music, because I think it's a really great place to explore um, the social experiences that we all have as human beings, but certainly the stories that we tell through our music and how those stories are represented, um, in all walks and shapes and forms of life.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm thinking about what you're talking about too, in terms of like various genres that are connected to this story of the African diaspora here in the Americas, and maybe first just to define those terms, like what do we mean by I'll start with the Americas. That part. What are we talking about? We're talking about North America, South America, the Caribbean, Central America. So a really broad version of the Americas, um, and um, and then the idea of diaspora is the idea of a a community or culture that has been kind of spread out, right? And so when we talk about the African diaspora, we're talking about many different experiences from many different geographies. Um, and not just one place. And it's connected to a lot of genres that people may or may not associate with this story of of um, African heritage communities that are now in the Americas. And we'll of course we're going to get into we're going to contextualize some of that history of what was the process um, that that established different African American communities up and down the Americas. But I want to go back to I think we've used this previously, Ben, but just a list and some images of the different genres we're talking about. And I know that I probably missed some, so if you see something missing, call it out. But I want to share um, from from one of our slides here what we're talking about. So just to first, for folks that uh, forgive me for being eternally a social studies teacher, but for anyone who just needs a visual of where in the world we're talking about. So here are the Americas, right? So North America, the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And when we talk about the African diaspora, we're talking about the people of the continent of Africa that have fanned out to other parts of the globe. So certainly, there's African diaspora all over the world, but we're focusing on this part of the world, right? Um, and the other day, you and I were getting ready for this. We're talking about all the different genres. So this I think of as like a partial list of the different genres that are either gifts of the diaspora. Um, so I mean, what tell us a little bit about where on this list, if you were to map yourself on this list, Ben, where do you sit mostly?
Well, um, I just want to, for all of you that are watching this, I mean, just look at that, because this really is it really is kind of a snapshot. I mean, there's so many other categories and subgenres and directions that music has gone, but like even just looking at that, I mean, that is impressive.
Yeah.
I mean, you could spend days on each one of these these particular genres listening to this music. Um, for me, um, I really don't like to subscribe myself to a genre, but because I grew up listening to classical and Motown and rock and roll and blues. I also grew up listening to reggae and samba and tango and salsa and mariachi, being from Phoenix. And so in my profession, I guess I'm blues and jazz, um, but I really do love playing all sorts of music. So I'm gonna just say that I'm a musician uh, that dabbles in as many things as I possibly can. Um, when given the opportunity, which is another reason I love the violin, because the violin exists all over the world. I get to play all sorts of different stuff, whether it's shoto or jazz or tango or blues, whatever. So I know that's not an answer to your question.
That's okay. And maybe it wasn't even really that fair of a question because, because it's true. Music. We, as musicians, we are focused in the language of music, and then genres can almost be like dialects, right? So if we think of music as language, then we move between different dialects or between even between different languages, and each one has its own convention, but we don't have to speak just one or two. Um, and I just, the other thing, just again, being a social studies nerd, I went and tried to graph these out, see what it would look like on a map. And again, I know this is not a complete representation, but it gives you an idea gives one an idea of the the total extent of what we saw on that list and all the different places that are touched and shaped by the experiences of the diaspora.
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating, and even in just talking about blues, folks, genres kind of often do a disservice to the breadth of individual artists, because for the recording industry at least, um, music was broken up into hillbilly music and race records, and like as I mentioned before, with recording black fiddlers and black violinists, the record in the early days, the recording industry just thought that white people wanted to listen to this and black people wanted to listen to that, and so this figure of a black male bluesman sitting on a porch is what we think of when we think of the blues. But Lonnie Johnson and Leroy and Mance Lipscomb and all these people that and Mississippi John Hurt, they could play all sorts of different types of music. It's just this was what was recorded, and this is what the recording industry wanted to sell. And many of the people that float in and out of these other styles and genres that you have, they're musicians. They live to play music, and so at any given time, just like many people can speak various dialects of the language depending on what region they're in, so can these musicians play these various different dialects of music, just because the universality and love and passion for the sounds can rarely be defined to this one thing.
Yeah, and that reminds me too. As you're talking about, the genre, how we can sometimes put things into boxes that wouldn't necessarily be self-ascribed to boxes. I'm thinking about a playlist of music that we worked on for tonight, so I put that in the chat for people to check out.
It's
It's
awesome. I listened to it all. It was great.
Really, you had all 5 hours?
I was in the car, and there's songs that I already knew, so I
Yeah,
could
yeah,
I
yeah.
could fast forward to songs that I didn't know. But it was great.
Yeah, yeah. So hopefully there's something there for everyone, some surprises and things too. And and I think that the other things, when you talked about how the power of record labels, putting together this list of music that goes back, basically 500 years. Um, it was really interesting starting to compile stuff from the early 20th century once recordings were available, because it was like, even the question of, because recording technology arrived at one point, but that didn't mean that music created by black musicians was being included on what was being recorded. And so there's multiple levels. There was that question of how music was put in a box, and then that question of even just um, getting those voices onto the wax cylinders in the first place. Investing in that effort to maintain and archive those musical expressions.
Not to mention that and we again there's so many things to unpack with this topic, but just to put something else onto the recording industry, and the fallacies and the the misrepresentations. The original Dixieland Jazz Band was the first jazz band to be recorded as an all-white group, and so a lot of folks, at least in the past, maybe they're getting better now, subscribed whiteness to the jazz genre. But that was only because Fletcher Henderson, who was asked first, didn't want to be recorded because he didn't want his stuff to be stolen. He didn't want somebody else to bite his style, because that was his income. And so it also we also have to think about the context and the stories that surround these musics, especially as we're talking about early music learning, and like how we teach and how we develop the our educational standards and facts, so that we make sure that we tell the right story. And sometimes we just have to uncover all these layers of fallacy that were intentionally built up to portray one type of truth.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you brought that up because I'm thinking about how that's a particular issue for early music specifically, especially given, the fact that so many of us have come through, although not me included, but I've come through, conservatory programs where the primacy of of written music, of printed music, is just, it's so well established that even that can affect our sense of like what early music is, in the same way that that affects our perception of early literature or storytelling. It's so based on the printed word in the case of literature, or the printed note in the case of music. And in what ways are we misguided by that, particularly when we're talking about the music of communities that were intentionally kept from becoming literate, whether it was in letters or in music transcription or whatever it was, um, or that were prevented from the resources that would allow them to to engage in that. And so, when we, I know for me, working in early music of communities that were not the dominant society, um, there were not those resources to or sometimes not even that value around transcribing music. In one of our earliest sessions, we talked a lot about the interconnection between poetry and music, and how, when we look at early music now, we have these kind of like divested fragments of, you might have something that is like the early version of a chart, and then you have like a text, but we don't always have a sense of how those things were integrated. And so I think, yeah, with records and with printed music, we, if we say that's the only breadcrumb trail we're going to follow, we're not going to we're not going to find everything.
Well, and I think it extends, gosh, coming back to this recording industry, it extends into music like old time, for instance. I remember when I first went to an old time festival in Portland, uh, 12 years ago, 13 years ago or something. I was uh, I was sitting in this circle of old time players, and you play this song and you kind of play it over and over and over again, and it's dance music. The music is built for there to be dancing and festivities around you. Um, but like me being the person that I am, I'm playing the song. I'm learning the song as I'm playing it because I'm just getting into this music. But then I start like messing around with it and doing different things to it, and everybody got so mad at me. And they're like, "That's not how you play the song. That's not how you do it." And then you start to talk. You get deeper into it, and then people are like, "Well, the recording from 1920 whatever plays it like this, and that's how you're supposed to play it." But it I bring this up to talk about there's this Western culture that says that this technique, this style, this way is how you play this music, or how you perform this music. But then there's this whole other rest of the world that either notates their music differently or is built on an oral culture. Um, and so when you talk about traditional music, you have to, we defined diaspora, we defined the Americas. We also have to redefine what traditional is, because traditional, by my definition, is a living thing. And so to think that traditional is a static thing detracts from the whole process that it took this music to get to the place that it is now. And if we zoom out even further outside of music and start defining these traditions by like this static non-living thing, we find ourselves getting into really serious trouble, because you take context out of it and you take imagination out of it and you take people's lives and the way that we process things out of it over the course of centuries and centuries and centuries. You're leaving out all the different um, uh, highways and byways that the music has gone through to get to this place that we're at right now. Even the kora, for instance, one of my favorite instruments, the thing is only like 200, 300 years old, So like, what was it before that, and before that, and before that? Well, it has
Yeah.
all these different instruments that still exist today, and so we just have to we have to remember that, not just in music, but in everything that we consider traditional.
Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking about that, especially when we look at like the tradition of Western classical music, which, has kind of dominated the world of music in terms of conservatories and
Education,
music
yeah.
history and
Mhm.
so on. And it's so focused. It's like being an athlete that only works one machine, and so you've got one arm that's like giant muscles. Like we're really good at recreating this particular vision of this certain set of composers from this 100-year span. But what have we lost along the way, even within Western Europe? How were the traditions around improvisation, both instrumental and vocal, lost in that process of calcifying around precise performance of a particular vision? and and as you say, how does that shape differently in different cultures around the globe, and particularly um, in looking at the diverse experiences of the African diaspora here in the Americas, which I think as Americans, a lot of people think, okay, African diaspora in the Americas is African Americans, like Black Americans in the U.S. What should we add to that list?
Well, first we need to we need, as you mentioned before, we need to stop saying America as if the United States of America is the only America that exists. That's problematic on so many different levels. But it just speaks to, you know, I don't want to use the word ignorance, but I have to because it's really part of uh, how language can force us to see things one particular way if we don't train ourselves to understand what the definition of that language is. Um, but just to speak to one little point about African American, especially now, you know, I was born in Lesotho. I spent time living in Zimbabwe. My father was from Tanzania. Uh, you know, so much of my experience as a black person in this country comes from my experience living in Africa, um, and separated from the black experience of America. And just in that example, just gives you like a glimpse of the complexity that is the African diaspora. So that when we're talking about African American, I mean, like, even within African American, you have folks that are from the South, folks that are from the North, folks that are from Central United States, East Coast, West Coast, all these different places. Not to mention, just even contained in the United States, folks that are African, Mexican African, or Caribbean African, black. Like there's just so many different dynamics, and all of that needs to be considered. Not and like and I think important for like maybe people in the audience have that are white, like you have Irish blood, you have Lithuanian blood, you have German blood, you have all these different things, and so to boil yourself down to African American or to whiteness is really doing a disservice to the whole conversation and complexity that is humanity.
Hmm. Hmm. And yeah, that is a very powerful reminder. I think one of the privileges of whiteness is this idea of that you can, if you choose, cast away that history that is Lithuanian or Greek or Hungarian or German, whatever it is, and you just become something else. And I think there's privilege in that, and I think there's also a sense of loss in that.
Yeah,
You gain
yeah.
privilege to certain things, but you lose some stuff too.
Significant loss, and I think, my musical partner Joe Siemens, um, has been doing a lot of work around heritage lately, especially with white folks, um, recognizing his story as a white male and the privilege that comes with that, but also like, what does it do to what how does it serve him to like reach back into his family heritage and understand that white male is is doing a disservice to his identity, right?
Hmm.
And it's not giving him all that he can be or it already is, and the person that he has within him, as opposed to just like homogenizing himself to get in where you fit in kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think that speaks so much to this music, um, and one of the themes that we've been talking about in our sessions has been resiliency, and I think one of the other distractions, I suppose, of whiteness is that, or detractions of whiteness, is that what that means is that there's that absence of culture. So then appropriating other folks' culture becomes this kind of like hunger and thirst for, and I
Hmm.
think that has helped. Um, in a bittersweet silver lining kind of way, uh, is part of why there are so many different genres of like African diasporic music, because once something gets appropriated or like taken, well then there's this resilience piece that comes that's a part of our black identity that's like, well, okay, fine, take it, I'm gonna create something else. And that's
Mm.
how you get all the different subgenres of jazz. Bebop was a direct response to that. Like, this music is being taken away from us, we need to create something that is ours again. Funk, soul, Motown, R&B, all these different, like, we'll call them subgenres just so that we can like speak to like the theft and appropriation of something, and then the resilience to be able to create something else. And my experience and knowledge obviously is absent of South America and part of the Caribbean. So I'm sure you would have a lot to say about some of that too, coming from the other portion of the Americas.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, well, and but before we go there, I want to go to one of the instruments you have with us. So because I have to say, growing up, like I saw a banjo. You know where I saw a banjo? I saw it on Hee Haw. And so I had this vision of like banjo music and kind of like this perception of the of race with regard to banjo music that was pretty white. And you kind of alluded to this with some of the experiences that you've shared. There's a lot of artists and scholars that are starting to pick this apart now, and Rhiannon Giddens chief among them. Um, but I want to kind of break down this idea. I want to use the banjo as an example of what you're talking about. So I'm wondering if you would share with us uh, uh, your banjo, and then we can kind of peel the onion and go a little bit, go backwards instead of going forwards in time. We'll go backwards in time, but start with the instrument that you got right there with you in the studio.
Yeah, well, let me reach back to my other banjo. Uh, this is probably severely out of tune, so I'm not going to really play it for you. But this is kind of what we think of as a banjo. Now, this is a tenor banjo. It's a four-string banjo. It's not your five-string bluegrass banjo. This would have been something that would have been used more in jazz, or jug band style music, um, even Irish music. But the banjo that I have, that speaks to the other side of this. This is a gourd banjo, and so it's a little bit more emblematic of what you of maybe the earlier iterations of the American, United States of American banjo that was developed from the memory of enslaved Africans when they came across, during the slave trade, and then of course it's developed itself to being this, kind of more, I don't know, mechanical looking instrument. It's got all these metal rings and barbs and doodads and things like that. And because of that, it can be strung tighter. And so because of that, it has a higher, twangier sound, which is super. I think, hee haw, as you mentioned, that kind of style, as opposed to, this sound, which is much deeper and more resonant. and you know that that's kind of like just a style that I'm working on that's kind of derivative of kora playing. But you know, some of the styles that would have been more specific to African American culture is clawhammer style, which sounds a little more like this. And then bluegrass style banjo, I have absolutely no idea how to play, and at the moment, I have no yearning either. At the moment, who knows what'll happen later in life? It's too many other things on the list. But this instrument would have come, you know, we see styles of this, we can see the representation of this in African instruments today. Stuff like the nkonting or the ngoni or the adungu. And even if you were to turn this in a vertical fashion, this would look very similar to a kora. You know, or an instrument like that has a calabash, a gourd,
Resonator.
resonator.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, with the kora just plain, kind of spun flat, so you can play it like a harp lute style. Um,
Exactly.
and and then you also talked a little bit about different styles of playing these instruments, and there was a comment from Dan who was asking about um, different styles of tambourine playing too. So I want to jump over to some other instruments like tambourine and bones, and talk about
Cool.
and demonstrate how some of those different instruments would be played. And I think that this story of I can geek out about tambourines all day. It's ridiculous. Um, but yeah, I
Prove
know
it.
because yeah, it's I thank God you're here because, I mean, most people would just go running out the door. But tambourine is an instrument that it can be seemingly so pedestrian, but I love how there's around the globe so many different ways of playing a tambourine. So and then even just the what a tambourine is called. There's an interesting story. So the tambourine in Spanish is called pandero, and in Portuguese pandeiro. And here's a Portuguese, or the name is in Portuguese, but this is a Brazilian pandeiro. And then but that word pandero and pandereta, the root of that is bendir, which is a North African word for a frame drum. So this is a small bendir with jingles in it. That might be a little bit closer to the frame drum great grandmother of the tambourine. So even in the name itself, we hear this story, and it's a reminder too that Africa comes to the Americas a couple different ways. Obviously, it survives the horrors of the Middle Passage, which we're going to look at some maps and things to better understand that momentarily. But it also comes embedded within Iberian culture itself, and so especially during the 700 years of Muslim Spain, we have this integration of North African musical ideas and this communication with sub-Saharan Africa too through the Muslim world, and that's chronicled by some of the great travelers of that time, like Ibn Khaldun. And so, for Dan, for your question about different ways of playing the tambourine, um, there's so a North African style would be to hold it like this, and then as it travels to the New World, it's played all these different kinds of ways. Um, and so you've got, I don't have like a plena drum, but a plena drum is a frame drum without jingles in Puerto Rico, and is part of Afro Caribbean music. And you hold it, same way, kind of vertically. And then in Brazil, the sambistas and folks that play the different styles there, from North and South Brazil, historically held it up here, but now oftentimes people will play it horizontal. Um, and then in Mexico, see, I told you, tambourines and me, it's dangerous. It's like lighting a fuse.
It's awesome.
So so that's in the son jarocho music of Veracruz, for example, which is the Gulf Coast, which has a very deep, profound African heritage. Son jarocho is essentially, these are African roots at work that are expressed in, more recently in tambourines, but for many centuries in instruments that are related to the guitar, like the jarana, and and then also in the feet of the dancers. So not a string player. So anyway, but um, so hopefully, Dan, that kind of gets a little bit to some of your questions about tambourines. And the other thing, Ben, I want to go back to what you were saying about the construction of the banjo in the Americas, and this idea of, you said, from memory, and I want to kind of take people through that this idea, that something that I talk a lot about with my students is there's no checked baggage in this history. Um, in terms of being able to bring physical objects, and so people were subjected to whole scale dehumanization, and had to go through this process of calling on his on historical cultural memory to sometimes to recreate something, or to build something anew, so to speak. Is it okay, Ben? I would love to share with folks the map that we've been using.
Yeah, please.
Um, and so this map uh, shows a little bit of, to help give us a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about um, the how people of Africa came to the Americas, specifically in the context of industrialized slavery. So what we see in this age of the colonization of the Americas is parallel with that. To to make money in this colonial enterprise required, um, well, required is not the right word. The choice was made to, in order to maximize profits, to minimize costs, and that led to a whole scale process of slavery, first among indigenous people, and then after debates in Spain in the 16th century, really ramped up um, whole scale slave trade out of West Africa. And in the map, we can see that that's coming from many different places. And so, there are folks from Senegambia region, Sierra Leone, from, even just from a place like modern day Nigeria, there's Yoruba and Igbo, there's Angolans from southern West Africa, other Bantu and Congolese, and many different cultures that were impacted by this, and then ended up in a lot of places. A lot of times, folks think of, again, that conversation of African Americans, and they think, okay, well, Black Americans in the U.S. But look at the numbers. Look at the thickness of the arrows that are pointing to other parts of the Americas. Um, and I mean, in that, just to share, representation of, why you would have to carry something by memory. It's painful. It's a painful history to to contemplate. But here we can see images, a historic diagram, and then an artist rendering of what that middle passage, that transatlantic journey, looked and felt like, in a journey where people were treated as less than human, and would spend weeks at sea in a situation where they could not even sit up fully when they were below deck. Um, and then the numbers, the relatively small numbers in North America compared to the numbers that we see in the Caribbean and South America. I'll jump out of the slide there, but um, well, except to say that this brings us back to the theme that you were talking about, Ben, of resilience. And we had gathered some other words here, and you had added reclamation to the list when we were talking, in the planning process. Which of these words resonate the most for you?
Well, I guess how this all works. I was asked to do this series of talks um, for Bellevue School District, when I started talking about the history of race and inequity in the American education system, and then in the music education system, and then the next talk was minstrelsy and its effect on black students. However, I changed the topic to be its effect on white students, and then my last conversation was a conversation on the American Songbook. It was all around race and inequity. It was a teacher training session, and the thing that I kept coming back to, and I think this is so perfect for the title of this conversation, not just Indomitable, but Deep Roots and New Branches, is that, and I mentioned this before with like a style being appropriated, and so the necessity to redefine and invent and kind of re-identify. But something that reclaim and re-identify really resonates with me, because you mentioned before, and I didn't even it didn't even come to me until when you said it, but the new world, right? This is our new world, and we keep fighting with this idea of tradition and how things are supposed to be, or like that was in the past, or like this is now, but then we hold on to things like the national anthem, for instance, as like a point of pride, when like the song itself is racist. It's a British fraternal drinking song, and we can't seem to move on from certain things. I think it's really important to teach the history as it is, and make sure that we tell the truth about the history. But that doesn't mean that we have to keep singing the songs the way that they're sung. I mean, history has proven that like instruments, can change and do change, and they hold on to pieces of what they were, the good parts, or the parts that need to maintain. I mean, it's straight out of biology, really. Um, but we need to be able to observe that past and like re-identify the future. And so songs like one of the teachers was talking about how for years she was teaching us a song called Jump Jim Row, and it was a song for kindergarten students, and it was kind of help to like understand their physicality, where their face is, their eyes are, and how to jump, blah 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 blah. But obviously, or maybe not obviously, I'm telling you, and you in the audience, that the song comes from one of the first early minstrel songs by T.D. Rice called Jump Jim Crow, which helped identify the term Jim Crow as the racist and bigoted term that it has become and maintains. But like, we could keep that melody for that song. The melody is just fine. All we need to do is change the words, you know? But we need to remember what the past was. And so for me, reclaim, re-identify, um, resonates really strongly with me, because we have to be able to change. That's just how life works. And we've already seen it in this conversation, how instruments have changed, how the tambourine and the style of play and the way you hold something changes. So why are we so afraid to make other changes? And it just baffles me sometimes, because that's really been the history of the African diaspora in its music, and in its fashion, and in its entirety. It's faith, it's religion, and I want the rest of the world to just accept that that's what we have to do. Not to like turn this into a macro conversation,
Mhm.
That's why that term means so much to me within music.
Well, and I think that those are really huge issues, particularly in the world of early music, which has, there's this ongoing kind of conversation about like, is early music a process of recreation and reconstruction of, are we essentially, um, museum interpreters, or are we living artists that are breathing new life into historical forms? And to what extent can we go back and forth in that process and be, like, okay, here's a historical construction of how I think, this instrument was and how it was played, and now here is my, as a 21st century person, and my positionality, with regard to race, gender, ethnicity, whatever, um, class, you know how am I going to approach this music now? And and I probably already shared this in this series, but one of the, the striking things that I remember hearing um, from Jordi Savall, is that, who's just, this kind of this titan of the early music world, yet has this very kind of open, flowing, I think, approach. In that, I asked him, I said, "Por qué música antigua?" Why ancient music or old music, early music? And he said, "No hay música antigua. Hay partituras antiguas. There's no early music. There are early parts, right? But the
Mm,
music is, as is lit anew every time that a new person
yeah,
puts it in their hands or in their
yeah,
voice."
yeah. And that really speaks to like the value of legacy in certain ways, like that this written music that you were talking about, right, in classical, like has to be this way. Yet in these oral traditions, like there is no early music, there is no antique music. It's constantly contemporary. I think and I think that also speaks to part of that idea of memory, right? Is this like these enslaved Africans held on to what they needed to hold on to survive that traumatic experience, so that they could renew it in some sort of way when they got to their next destination. And I just wanted to comment on Katarina's comment about that enslaved folks were forced to dance and play drums as entertainment. It wasn't even just entertainment. It was even sicker than that. It was to keep the blood flowing. It was to keep them sturdy, so that they got up on the top of the ship and danced a little bit, so that they maintained a certain part of their physicality for the auction block. But that was also part of how they brought over the banjo and learned or were introduced to Irish fiddling, because some of the ship folks had European violins on it too.
Hmm. Hmm. um, and I'm just, and I'm thinking, I'm seeing these. By the way, everyone, these comments are so great. Thank you so much for this, is because this is meant to be interactive, and I should have mentioned that, reminded folks earlier. um, and and I just also wanted to respond to one of the things you were talking about, Ben, in terms of like the way that music is created anew. And I think about, specifically in the experience of the African diaspora in the Americas, you have examples of all of it, because you have like, a prayer that is played in Santeria music, where there's a certain, arrangement for bata drums that is specific to, one of the deities in the, the Yoruban cosmology. This rhythm is a prayer for Yemanja or Shango, in the same way that this rosary that you say, that is very rhythmic in nature, by the way, is a prayer, to this theistic, Judeo-Christian God, and
Mm-hmm.
so on. And so, um, on the one hand, you have this careful preservation, but on the other hand, you have this like flat out, just kind of like innovation of, and using materials, when you're denied everything, when you're denied, next time when Monica is back, we'll have her talk a little bit about the history of the cajon, for example, which I'm sitting on one right now, which is a musical instrument, um, which, is was created by Afro-Peruvian communities, and also, Afro-Cuban communities had a cajon. Another example I've got with me is the quijada, which is also used in Peru and in the Caribbean and Gulf Coast of Mexico, right? When you are denied, any material belongings or any pay that allows you to to amass things. What do you use? How do you create amazing, beautiful things with what's around you? So, for folks who haven't seen this instrument before, the quijada, you can put in the chat what type of animal you think this jaw belongs to. So
So
that
cool.
probably made the volume levels peak a little bit. But
Well, what you're talking about is the same thing. Is the same thing with bones, right?
there you
It's just like
go.
like idiomphones come in all shapes and sizes, but like here are two sticks, and they usually were made with bones, which is why they're called bones. But here you have two sticks that you put them together, and they make a beautiful, cool sound. So I think it's necessity breeds creation.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's exactly what we're talking about. As we're getting close to 8 o'clock, I know some folks are going to have to head out. I want to acknowledge some of the comments. Randall mentions that the sad truth, with a lot of the changes that were being discussed tonight, um, have the potential for healing, but would require a lot of people to relinquish a lot of power that they may not even realize that they have. Yes. So there is both cultural power and structural power in the way are that we perceive music, and the way that the music economy is structured, and the music pipeline, so to speak, of music education. And Ben, both of us have worked with music educators in terms of working to kind of um, reorient um, how we approach music so that we appreciate um, a Western perspective, but we don't limit ourselves to it.
Well,
Uh,
and I also just to add a little bit to that, and for whatever it's worth, Randall, I think I agree with you. I think it's really hard for people to relinquish their power, but I also think that power is supported and reinforced by a false history. And I think if we were taught the truth, and if we were given the opportunity to explore the truth and humble ourselves to the truth, it makes us a lot easier to think of it as relinquishing power, but just coming to terms with reality. Because power can be shared. Nobody needs a $500 million yacht if you have been reading the news. But you know what I'm saying? Like, so I agree with you, Randall, and I just think that there are ways to bypass that if we just took simple steps to make sure that we're informed as a whole society.
and so that what to think about, those of us who are on the call tonight, or the presentation. What is our role? What are our roles as musicians? What are our roles as educators, as music consumers, audience members, parents? All those different roles that we have to interact with music as an expression of culture. And music is a beautiful thing, but we don't do music just for music's sake. It is a form of human connection. um, and let's see, I want to say thanks to Catalina, who she definitely guessed it. It's the quijada de burro, the
I
jaw. And let's see, um, and let's see, I
Yes,
want
we
to
can
also.
handle.
What's that?
No, I was just saying we can handle uncomfortable truths. It is possible. Agreed.
Yeah, yeah. And now there was another question which I could do a whole other session on as a percussionist working in early music, and that was that question about the so-called reintroduction of percussion into early music, especially in with regard to Western Europe. And I think, Dan, some of the sources to look at to get a sense of what percussion sounded like in Europe in the Middle Ages would be to actually look at North Africa, to current practice that's done in North Africa. And there's some artists that are doing that in both Spain and Morocco.
I did
Um,
a I was just gonna say I did a earlier in the pandemic. I did a research project for the new museum in Nashville, the African American Music Museum, on the history of the idiophone, the history of percussive instruments, especially that are done in your hands. Um, and if you check that out, it'll kind of give you a little bit of a taste of some of the traveling routes that idiophones traveled from Egypt through Russia and Western Europe and Ireland into the United States, and other parts of the Americas.
Are you gonna drop that in the chat, Ben, or?
I guess I should probably do that.
Yeah.
Now I gotta find it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and then we can post it with the recording on the Deep Roots page at Early Music Seattle. Here I am making promises of Early Music Seattle staff. Um, and yeah, I also am appreciating some real talk here that people are sharing. Randall, who is a composer, is talking about that sense of loss of connection. Um, and that that how do we perceive in terms of how does music belong to us or not belong to us with regard to genealogical heritage? How do we make room for people whose history has been taken from them to be connected to those traditions, and at the same time how do we make room to cross boundaries and to use the power of empathy and the power of really of music itself to feel a sense of connection to things that we may not be connected to? How do we respectfully engage with genres that may not be our own, so to speak? Because we don't want to just as someone who plays music from Brazil, I love that, but I'm not Brazilian and I can't speak for Afro-Brazilian culture. By the same token, if I limit myself just to my genealogical heritage, then I can only play music from South Texas or Southern Italy. So, somewhere in between is this idea of how do we respectfully engage with music that is, not ours, so to speak. Um, and I'm gonna pass it back to you so I have a chance to finish reading that comment. Are you
Yeah,
reading
and
it right
I'm just reading another comment from Randall, and I think that's a really interesting comment. I don't know if you know of a guy by the name of Elijah Wald, but he did a talk maybe a month or so ago talking about his relation. He's a historian, a writer, just a factory of knowledge on blues and folk music in the United States, as well as busked after high school through Eastern Europe and Africa, learning different styles. So he's got a lot of things to say. But as a Jewish person, raised as a Jewish person, he felt a lot of those same feelings of not being connected to that style of music, um, and being more connected to blues music. And here I am. I don't have a link either, but if you look up Elijah Wald on YouTube, you should be able to find that. And I'll try and find the link and send it to these guys so that they can put it in the whatever need that goes out to people to
now? Yeah.
follow up on this.
Well, and I think one step, Randall, because I think about this all the time as someone that does play music from a lot of different places, is how do I approach things as a respectful student, and that is to acknowledge, part of my positionality as a student. I'm not a master, and I make sure that my audiences know that, and I make sure that when I play something, to name what it is and where it's from, to give credit to if an individual composer is known, to make sure that composer is known, or the culture bearer that you learned it from, or at least the region or tradition that you learned it from. Those are huge steps, because that will help to prevent the idea of this kind of like misunderstanding of what something is. Like I think oftentimes about there's a scale that sometimes is called Hollywood Hijaz, and that is the what a lot of Western folks imagine that all Middle Eastern or Arabic music sounds like, is this one kind of scale, right? And so, the steps that we can take um, to not miss to intentionally cite our sources, so to speak. I mean, it turns out our seventh grade English teacher was right.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Cite our
And
sources.
it's an easy step. It's an easy step. For the audience of whoever you're playing for. But over time, it helps just build up a general humility that I think we all should have about our position in this ginormous world that we live in, where there's so much knowledge and information that is to be shared. But that doesn't mean it's ours to claim, but it's fine to share it, and that's I think that's an important distinction.
Mhm, mhm. Well, and I just really appreciate folks chiming in with their thoughts and their own, their own kind of point on this journey. And it is about journey. It is constant dialogue, and it's constant process of learning. And we don't always do things right, the first time. We go through a process of stumbling. And I think just acknowledging being on that path is an important thing that we can do as artists.
Absolutely.
And to acknowledge that we work in these different cultural contexts, where whether we're playing a saraband, or we're playing a jig, or a whatever it may
A
be.
mazurka.
But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, or a wawanko. So all of these things. See one more comment here. Um, and Dan says, "What is the opposite of Frankenstein's monster? Something beautiful that is made of different parts of other living things. American music and American culture is that thing that is our inheritance. I love seeing how many Black Americans are reclaiming their connection to country music, which they were definitely a part of creating." And yeah, we referenced Rhiannon Giddens. I mean, Ben, you and Joe are doing that work here on the West Coast of making those deep connections that are not Nashville country music, but like roots music, right? Roots country music, whether it's from Appalachia or it's from the coast of the Carolinas, um, and so and yes, Dan, jazz, it would be an example of that opposite of a Frankenstein's monster, right? What happens when when in New Orleans you have Africans, Creoles, the influence of the Mississippi Delta, the Caribbean influence, what they called, I think Jelly Roll called the Latin tinge, right? So I think it was Jelly Roll.
Yeah, it was
So
Jelly Roll and indigenous, and folks from France. I mean, England, Spain, everywhere.
yeah, and so that is our legacy to care for, as well as to swim in, right? Um, And I want to thanks all, in particular, I want to thank Gus and Amy at Early Music Seattle for sponsoring this conversation tonight. Also, a reminder that there is one more in this year's series of Deep Roots New Branches. We hopefully I'm not going too quick here in sharing that Early Music Seattle is definitely engaged in conversations about how this series can continue into a future season. But for this season, we have one more event, and that is on June 9, Wednesday, June 9, and that is called Arte y Justicia, and that is about the intersection of music and social justice movements, particularly in Latin America. So thanks to all. You can also go to earlymusicseattle.org, find the Deep Roots New Branches page, and you see all of our talks archived. There are 5 this season. And reminder too that there is a playlist on uh, Spotify that is kind of the companion piece to this talk, and I will repost that in the chat, and
It's
we'll make
really
sure
good.
that's available. Yeah. Yeah. And let's give it up for Benjamin Hunter. Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for being here. Gracias, obrigado. Thank
Thank you
you.
for having me.
I can't
Thank you
wait to
for
do it
having me.
again.
Yeah, I can't either.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Have a great night.